Hi, welcome to Board Gems. This is my regular video series with new videos on the 3rd, 13th, and 23rd of the month, in which I cover an older board game gem. This game that I'm covering in this episode originally came out in the 90s. It was self-published as a game called Premier. Now, the actual year it came out, I'm not very clear on. Board Game Geek, whoever updated that website, said it came out originally in 1996. But if you go to Spotlight on Games, which has a lot of great information on older games, that website says that the very first edition, Premier, came out in 1992, I think it said. But that was self-published by the designer, Dirk Henn, and his wife, and they had a company called DB Spiele. And they publish the games themselves, they make the games themselves. A lot of Dirk Henn games, after they were self-published, almost all of them, after he and his wife self-published them, they would then later on be republished by Queen. And we know Premier as Show Manager. So this edition, this long box, is Power Grid size. This edition came out in late 90s, like 97, something like that. A few years later, in the early 2000s, it was republished as Atlantic Star. Exact same game. Well, some very slight differences in the deck, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same game. I mean, this edition is about putting on musicals, hiring actors and then putting on musicals and making money and then borrowing money against those musicals to put on other, hopefully better musicals. And they replaced this setting with the somewhat more dry setting of cruise ships. Instead of hiring actors, you're buying cruise ships. And instead of musicals, you're putting on cruises around particular seas. But the game plays exactly the same way. And then in the early 2010s, we have a return to Show Manager. Now, this is in kind of Queen standard, slightly thick square box. So it's same as Ticket to Ride, but very slightly thicker. And this is the edition I'm going to show you. This is the most recent one. Even though this one first came out just like still 10 years ago. The box says it's for 2 to 6 players. It's best with 4 to 6. You can play it with 3. And in fact, the rules are actually slightly different in different editions on how you play it with 3. The box says it plays 2 players. I just don't know why you'd play this game if you had just the 2 of you. There's lots of games out there that are good with 2 players. Don't play this one. But it is a 3 to 6 player game. Ages 10 and up, I think that's pretty fair. The game is really simple to learn, but it's also a little unforgiving, and that's part of the reason why I like it. And the box says it takes about an hour. Again, that's probably pretty fair. With the rules as written in this edition, the 3-player game can definitely be shorter. But if you're playing with a full 6, it's going to be longer than an hour. It's going to be closer to a 90-minute game. Anyway, why don't I show you how this plays, this edition, and then I'll talk about why it's still a gem today. To set up the game, place the board on the table between the players. Shuffle up the deck of actor cards. Shuffle them up and then display 4 cards, starting with the $0 position. You can put the draw pile here, and this will be the discard pile. Here's the money in denominations of 10, 5, and 1,000. Each player, except for a 2-player game, I'm not going to teach a 2-player game, I'm just going to teach 3 to 6. But in a 3 to 6 player game, each player gets $18,000, as well as 4 tickets with a particular instrument on it. You'll see there's 6 different instruments, 1 instrument per player. So each player claims an instrument for themselves. We'll set it up for a 4-player game, and the remaining 2 will be sort of dummy players, but they won't actually be controlled by the other players. Instead, they will have sort of a default value for the musicals. And for me to explain that, maybe I should explain the whole idea of the musicals. You see, each player will have 1 ticket per musical. There are 4 musicals requiring 6, 5, 4, and 3 actors. And each musical has a number of roles for those actors. And actors are on these cards here, and on the bottom of the card, it shows what roles and musicals those actors are particularly well suited for. So for example, for this actor, he is well suited for 3 roles. Moonlight, that's the blue one, role D, Gus. Lipstick, role E, Benjamin, or role C for Queenie, the writer. If you cast this actor in your musical in that role, they will contribute to the value of that musical. And you're trying to get, obviously, most valuable musicals. Some actors, however, are only well suited to a single role, like these 3. This guy can only play Big Daddy. If you put him in any other role, he is miscast. And we'll talk about being miscast later. Each player will, by the end of the game, put on 4 musicals, 1 of each type. All the musicals of a particular type, so all the rats or all the lipsticks, will be in one column, which they mark by city. And the first player to complete a musical chooses which city that musical will take place in. And from that point on, any other musicals that are made of that type will go into the same city. So then they can be compared from highest value to lowest value. So they will get sorted in these 6 spaces, and the number next to it is how many victory points the player will get at the end of the game. So the most valuable musical in London will gain its player 20 points. Note the differences in the scores, the values for each city. The most valuable musical in the entire game will be whichever musical is first place in New York. That's worth 22 victory points. But the worst will be worth 0. Whereas Stockholm, which is not quite so accustomed to really excellent musicals, and hey, they'll take what they can get, honestly. The most valuable is only worth 14, but even the bad musicals are still worth something. So over the course of the game, each player will put on 1 of each of the 4 musicals. And there's always, in a 3 to 6 player game, there'll always be 6 musicals of each type. So in a 4-player game, there will be 2 non-playing companies, I suppose, that will also put on these musicals. And they will have starting values. So I'm actually going to set this up right now for a 4-player game. And so I'm going to go ahead and add the values of these musicals. Now these tickets are glossy, and you use a dry erase marker, or in older editions might be a crayon or a colored pencil, to write the value of the musical on the top part. We're just going to set those aside for now though. You'll see how those come into play later. So pick a start player. Play is clockwise from there. On a player's turn, they have 2 optional things they can do, and then 1 mandatory action. The first optional thing they can do is they can borrow against an existing musical, which is hard to explain at the beginning, so I'll come back to that. You're not going to be doing that at the beginning of the game anyway. The next thing you can do is, optionally, flush all of these actors. If you don't like any of these actors, you can pay $2,000. They all go away, and then we draw a new 4. And again, filling from the 0 up. And a player on their turn can do this multiple times. If they're looking for a particular actor for a particular role, they can spend another $2,000, flush those. It can happen many times. But eventually, they have to do one of the 2 actions. And the 2 mandatory actions, you do one of the 2, is either hire an actor or put on a show. To hire an actor, you hire one of the 4 actors that's face up, and you pay the amount next to them. So this one is free, but if you want this one because you want to put on rats, and this is a really good actor to play Bruno, then you'll have to pay a whopping $3,000. If you hire an actor, that's all you can do. The other possible mandatory action you can do on your turn is you can put on a show. And to do that, you need at least as many actors as the play requires. So Moonlight, the biggest musical, requires 6 actors. The smallest one, Rats, only requires 3. So you need at least 3 actors to put on Rats. But there's another wonky rule, a little bit of a strange rule. You can't just keep drafting actors over and over and over again hoping to get the good ones. At some point you have to put on a musical. And the way that's enforced is a hand limit. If you'll see at the bottom here, there's a maximum hand limit for each of the 4 musicals. What this means is, in order to put on that musical, in order to put on the show, you cannot have more than this many actors in your hand. So if you have 6 cards in your hand and you want to put on a show, you cannot put on Rats because the maximum is 5. You would have to put on Queenie or Lipstick or Moonlight. And what that means is if you have a hand of 8 cards, you have to put on Moonlight. You don't have any other choice, and you certainly can't draw another actor. This is a very easy rule to forget, and there's no accommodation if you accidentally break that rule. So how do you put on a show? Well, you will have a number of actors. Let's say we were putting on Queenie. We may have these actors, for example. You announce what show you're going to put on. You can only put on each show once. So that means you would still have the ticket for it. So if we were to put on Queenie, for example, you still have to have the ticket for Queenie. And then you declare which actors are going to be in which roles. So you have this actor to play Emmy Sloan, so that's A. And then this actor to play B, Mr. Big Shot, C, the writer, and D, Miss Taylor. Now this is very good because each actor is well suited for their role. But you can put any actor in any role. But if they don't have the actual letter and musical, the color or name of the musical, for the particular role you're putting them in, that's a miscast. But when you put on the show, you calculate, you sum up the values of all the actors in the roles in which they're well suited. In this case, all actors are well suited for their roles. You have an actor for A, B, C, and D. So you total it up. 9 plus 3 is 12, plus 5 is 17, plus 2 is 19. And there's also a bonus. A bonus if all your actors are well suited for their roles. In the case of Queenie, that bonus is 4. So the total will be 23. And you would write 23 on the top part of your ticket. Now you can put any actor in any role. You could put on this show for Queenie if you want to, or even this one. You can put any actor in any role. However, if their card does not show that role, then they are miscast, and they do not contribute to the value of your musical and also keep you from scoring the bonus. So this musical would only be worth 10, 3, 5, and 2. Now there are also wild cards, like this one. You see it has X and a 1. These wild cards are well suited for every role, and they will add 1 to any roll. 1 is the worst score, it's not a very good value, but because they're always well suited, they will always help you get the bonus. So if you didn't have her and instead you put this actor in for the role of Emmy Sloan, the score would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 9, 11, plus the bonus of 4, 15. So you put on a musical, and all the cards that you used get discarded, and you have to make sure that when you put on a musical, you have no more than 2 cards left in your hand. The first player who put on this particular show chooses which city it will go in. For the rest of the game, all Queenie shows will be played in the same city, so we can compare apples to apples. In this case, the player who put on Queenie thinks that's a pretty good result. I might put it on, let's say, London. Now, if there are any dummy players, any ones that were pre-written, like this one, they also get added, like so, to the same city. By the end of the game, there will be 6 Queenie shows, all in London. The lowest valued one will be worth 1 point, and the highest valued one will be worth 20. So from now on, another player, if they put on Queenie, it will definitely go into London, and these will be resorted. If another player puts on Queenie and their value is 22, then the tiebreaker is the one that was already there, so the 22 would move under the existing 22, and this would shift down. Once a player has put on a show, a new optional action is made available to them on future turns. At the start of your turn, you can pick one of your existing musicals you've already put on and gain money by decreasing its value. Each player starts with $18,000. There is no other way to gain more money in this game than borrowing money on your existing musicals. So at the start of your turn, before you hire an actor, before you put on a show, before you even spend $2,000 to flush these cards, you may take one of your musicals that you have not yet borrowed anything against and change its value and get money for each value that you decrease it. That's the reason they have this little, these 2 areas. So you have the upper area and this tiny little arrow going down to the bottom area. On a later turn, a player, one time, can take their musical and subtract from this total and get the difference in money. The maximum you can take is $10,000, which would decrease by 10. So 23 would become 13, and then immediately this goes down and gets reordered, because now 13 is worse than 18. And the player would take $10,000, and that will remain at 13 for the rest of the game. Importantly, you can only borrow from each musical once. So if this player decided they wanted to be ahead of this one, then they would want to, say, pick 19. That's an upside down 9, not very convincing. And then this would be reordered. So now this 19 is above the 18, and they would they would gain $4,000. But they can never borrow from this again. It's one time only. And once a city fills up, so all the Queenie productions are on the board, no player can borrow from their production of that. So players are going to keep going like that, clockwise, around the table, hiring actors and putting on shows until all players have put on all shows. So once a player has put on all 4 shows, so all 4 of their tickets are on the board, they're done. And again, note that they can't have more than 2 actors left over at the end. But they sit out for the rest of the game until all players have finished. And then you total up the scores. Each musical is worth victory points for its owner based on the number next to it. So these are dummy players. This is an actual player, and this player, the saxophone, will get 15 points. So you total up all the scores for all your musicals, and the player with the most points wins. Money left over is a tiebreaker. That's it. You're ready to play Show Manager. Show Manager has an interesting place in history because I think it may be the first board game that had a mechanism which is extremely common now. And that is the idea of the gradually decreasing price of something that's not picked. So you have the row of 4 cards, and the prices range from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3. And you can buy any one you want, but then new cards come in, they start at the expensive price, and they slide down. Maybe looking back, it's a very obvious thing, but somebody had to do it first. And I believe Dirk Henn with Show Manager was the first designer to come up with this idea. But it's appeared in lots and lots of games since then. Obviously, That's a great mechanism. Now, how does the game overall fit in with that? Like, how good is the game, and is the game still enjoyable today? You don't buy a game just for its one mechanism, usually. It's a little bit brutal. It's a little bit unforgiving for a couple of reasons. So one is money is very, very tight in the game. And if you get lucky with the card pulls, then you won't suffer in terms of money, usually. But very often, because of the hand limit, right, you're limited to the number of actors that you can hold. And at some point, you have to put on the show. You can't just keep drawing and drawing until you get what you need. No, you're bringing these actors on board and you're paying them to do nothing. No, at some point, you have to put on the show. When your turn comes around, maybe you need an actor to do that particular role. You need an actor to do like green D. I need a green D, and there isn't one. So you can spend $2,000, flush all those cards away, and get 4 new ones. And then maybe you'll get lucky with a green D. Maybe not, but you can keep spending money, and it's very easy to burn through all your money. So it's brutal in that way. There's a real tension in the game because you start off with a certain amount of money, and it feels like a lot when you start, but you can very easily blow through it. And you need to decide when to borrow from your existing musicals. Put on a show, get some value for it, maybe hopefully see how other people are doing in their shows, and then borrow against those shows. The game calls it borrowing. I guess thematically that's what it is, but you never pay it back in game terms. You're just devaluing the show in order to get money. And, if you play it right, you can get a few free bucks, but not actually change your place in the ranking, and so you don't lose any victory points. But, when to borrow, how much to borrow, whether you can get by without borrowing at all, especially if you're going to lose a place and lose victory points, that's a really interesting decision, and it's really tense. But it's brutal and unforgiving in another way. I mentioned in the Samurai video the idea of player binding, like the left-right binding, in that your success is very much determined on the player that played before you, usually to your right. If the player preceding you in turn order is trying to collect actors for the same musical you are, generally speaking, you're only acquiring actors at one time for one musical. You're going to hire actors, put on a show, then you'll have at most 2 left over. And if the player preceding you in turn order is also working on the same show, then they're going to be taking the good actors that appear, and they're going to leave you with worse actors, right? But that doesn't mean that you have to watch what other players are doing. And I have played games in which I noticed that the player to my right was working on blue, and I had started to work toward blue, but I changed tacts. I changed directions, decided to go for a different musical because I knew that player was going to get all the good blue actors. So maybe I should work on something else. I'd already collected 1 or 2 actors for my blue show, but I can hang on to those for the next show. I can hold on to 2 actors while I build towards the next show. So I'm going to change gears. I see the free actor is actually pretty good in yellow. I'm just going to do yellow. Later on, go back to doing blue, hopefully after that player to your right is finished with it. So you do have to watch what other players are doing, especially the player to your right. And if you want to be a jerk, you can also watch the player to your left and make sure that they don't get anything good, right? So if you see something and you got money to burn, you can flush cards just to get rid of cards that the player to your left would need. I don't personally play that way, but you can if you want. And it's unforgiving in another way. It's a really kind of a weird, wonky rule. So the rules say that when you are put on a show, you cannot have more cards in your hand than a certain number based on which show you're putting on. So if you're putting on the yellow show, that requires 3 actors. Your maximum hand limit is 5. So you can carry 2 actors forward for your next show, right? So as soon as you have 5, if you're wanting to put on yellow, you have to put on yellow after you have 5. As soon as you take a 6th actor, you are now no longer allowed to put on the yellow show, because if you did, you use up 3, you have 3 left, it's too many. If somebody has a hand of 8 cards, on their next turn, they have to put on the blue show. They have no choice. And if they already had put on blue, too bad for them. They've messed up. So, okay, how do you fix it? Rules don't say. The rules just say don't do it, but it's very easy to do accidentally. So I just find that during the game, I'm constantly reminding people, like, don't forget about the maximum hand limit. And especially when I'm playing with gamers, they're like, yeah, we get it, Daryl. It's not hard to remember, but it's so easy to forget. So I just like to smooth things over and remind people. The other thing I like to remind people about, especially when I'm playing on the lower player counts, is reminding them to borrow money. So you start off with $18,000 in a typical game, and it feels like a lot at the beginning, but if you're flushing the cards a lot or you're paying top dollar for the perfect actor, you can run out very easily. Now you can borrow on existing musicals, so you can devalue a musical in order to get money one time. So again, that's another decision point. How much do I borrow? Especially if I don't know what the value of some of those other musicals are going to be, how much do I dare decrease the value of my show and hope that I can still get good points for it, right? Will somebody else beat that score? Maybe I shouldn't get so much money and keep my value relatively high. But there's a time limit. So as soon as all 6 musicals have been put on of one type, so in the same city, you're no longer able to borrow from any of those shows anymore. Especially with, for example, 3 players. I play 3-player with my family. We enjoy it quite a bit. It's very easy to miss your opportunity to borrow money before suddenly the city is filled up, all the blue shows are done, and now you had intended to borrow money out that blue show, but now you can't anymore. Nice thing is in the game, of course, you can play with no money. If you have $0, you can still get actors. You just get the free actor every time. And any actor can fill any role. Then you put on the show with all these miscast actors, and your score in the end is something ridiculously low, like 3. And you can have a good laugh about it, right? But, that can leave a sour taste in some people's mouth if they're not watching for that, right? It does reward thoughtful play. In this game, if you just kind of stumble through and you're not really paying close attention, you can easily kind of get stuck in a ditch, basically. Pretty easy to avoid, but it is a good idea to play the game multiple times, especially with like new gamers or non-gamers. It's not a complicated game. Non-gamers can absolutely enjoy this game. It's a nice, easy to learn, potentially gateway game. It's just unforgiving. So the age range, I think, is appropriate. It says ages 10 and up. Again, rules-wise, 8 and up is fine. But because it's a little bit unforgiving that way, actually really unforgiving in a number of ways, you want a little bit of maturity when you play the game. Not that it's complicated to learn, but it's easy to make a mistake and then mess yourself up and get a low score at the end. There are some interesting strategies to do in the game. There's lots of, I won't call it multiple paths to victory, and that's a bit of an overused statement anyway. But there are different strategies you can do. So one strategy, for example, is to just get relative junk and then put on a show really, really early, right? The first player to put on one particular show gets to choose which city that show goes in. And there's a difference in cities. Some cities really reward valuable musicals, but don't reward at all bad musicals. But there are other cities in which the range is much less. You don't get as much for a good musical, but you still get some even for a bad musical. So one strategy is just kind of get cheap actors, make a play. It doesn't have to be a good play, a good musical, but you want it to be like at least over 10. Put that on as fast as you can. Choose the city, you choose the worst city, okay? Your musical's not going to do well, but you're still going to get some points for it. And on your next turn, you borrow from it, as long as its value is kind of over 10, because you can borrow no more than $10,000. So that decreases the value of the musical by 10. So if you have something that's, at least 10, then you can borrow money against it, and its value tanks, but you're not going to lose any victory points. And then you have a lot of money with which to work with for the rest of the game to put on better shows for the rest of the game. So you can do fun things like this. I really enjoy this game. I've often said that Dirk Henn is my favorite designer. However, there aren't a lot of particular games that he makes where I go, that's my favorite game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. I think the Rose King is the only one where I'm like, yeah, that's one of my favorites. But I just like his style of design. The way he thinks through the player motivations and makes the old style of games that I enjoy quite a bit, that have simple rules but quite a bit of player interaction. It doesn't have to be direct like with an auction or something, but you have to care. You care about what other people are doing and you're watching them, right? In Show Manager, late in the game, you want to see, maybe each player only has one show left that they have to do, and so you can also kind of play with it a bit to make sure that maybe the player to your left doesn't get a really good actor that they need for the show that they still have to put on. Those roles and the actors you're trying to hire to fill those roles, to me, feel perfectly balanced between easy to fill and hard to fill. You can stumble upon the right actor for the right role, but it might not be perfect. Maybe their value isn't super high, but it's good. It's enough to get the bonus, right? But if you flush, you might get that perfect actor, right? So you flush, you're not getting it. It's tempting, flush again, flush again. The odds are good enough that you want to keep doing it, keep trying to find that perfect actor. So the designer really balanced that well. If you have the roles are too hard to fill, then people are just going to do whatever with it and then kind of put on crappy plays, right, without getting the bonus. So you want people to work towards those roles. You want it to be possible, but it just is just a little bit frustrating, right? Enough so that when you flush and you don't get the actors you're looking for, you can kind of curse your bad luck. And then in the end, if you lose, you don't feel too bad. It's like, well, that was the luck of the draw. I flushed, I didn't get what I was looking for. I wasted so much money flushing, right? You have an excuse. And the best games, in my opinion, are the games that if you win, you feel like you won due to skill. And if you lose, you feel like you lost due to luck. And Show Manager is definitely like that. Speaking of balance, the decks, the deck of actors or ships, in the case of Atlantic Star, are slightly different between the three editions. So in the first edition of Queen's first edition, so the lower one here, Show Manager, I think it had 120 cards. And for the later editions, they added more cards. And they added more cards which are the three types. Basically more versatile actors that can do three different roles well, but just not be particularly high scoring in any of them. So by adding more of those cards, it makes it a little bit easier to find the perfect actor that maybe not necessarily for the score, for their value that they add to the musical, but help you get the bonus, right? It's easier to find actors to fit those precise roles. So with the first edition Queen Show Manager here, it was harder to get the bonus. So more likely you're getting actors and you can't exactly get what you need, but you still put on a show. The bonus is a bonus, it's extra. And starting with Atlantic Star and then the later Show Manager, you're really trying to get the bonus every time. It's no longer feels like an extra thing. It feels more like, I really need to try to get this. And the cards make it a little bit easier to achieve that. I don't have a preference between the two. If we're talking about differences between the editions, I'll prefer the musical edition over Atlantic Star just because it just feels more like a fun setting, right, of putting on musicals. I mean, it doesn't really come through in the play of the game all that much, but it's still better than Atlantic Star, where you're hiring ships to put on cruises. That one's a little bit harder to get into. But again, mechanically, all the games work the same, pretty much, and so I'm happy to play any of them. There isn't really a reason to go for the older editions if you can get the more recent edition. That's the middle one here. If you can get that relatively inexpensively, that's the way to go. The board is really large. In the older editions, you had two separate boards. So you had the board in which you put on the tickets, I suppose, the ones where you write the numbers on. And then the board for holding the cards that you buy from was a separate, smaller board. I find it better to use the bigger board that has that market built into the board. And the reason is because when you're flushing the cards, there's a lot of maintenance in the game. A lot of maintenance. If one person, like the owner, me, likes to kind of, keep things running smoothly, so they do a lot of the maintenance, right? Okay, I'll flip the cards, I'll clean out the market, right? And do whatever, little maintenance you have to do during the game. I'm the one that does it. And I'm doing it a lot in this game because almost every turn, a player is buying a card. So they're getting a card, then you have to slide the other ones down and put one down. But they may also instead flush. Okay, get rid of those 4 cards, put them on the discard pile, add 4 new ones. Okay, flush again, right? It's really tedious. But I like the game so much, it doesn't bother me. But yeah, those older editions, they're on the market, I suppose you call it, is on a smaller board. And it's just not as easy to flush because it's very easy to kind of move the board when you're just trying to, wipe all the cards away. And in the case of Atlantic Star, instead of it being a line, it's like a half circle. So it's not as easy. You gotta buy this card and you have to slide like that and like that. It's not as easy as if it was just in one direction. Very minor things, though. I actually don't know about the older edition because this copy that I have here has a colored pencil in it, but I don't think it was one that came with the game. I think it's been replaced. Atlantic Star, the version I have here, does have the original, which is a wax crayon. And in the newer edition, it's a dry erase marker. Dry erase is the way to go, and those tickets are really large in the newer Show Manager. Another difference in the editions is how they handle a 3-player game. So in the oldest edition, the bottom one here, I forget what I was saying. Oh yeah, 3-player game. So when you're playing with fewer than 6 players, so let's say 4 or 5 players, you still play until the entire city, I suppose, with 6 spaces fills up. So the way that's accommodated is there's sort of a dummy player. They're not really a dummy player in the sense that players aren't controlling them. They're just preset values for musicals. And as soon as somebody makes a musical of a particular type and chooses a city, then all these kind of spare ones that have preset values also get added. So that by the end, there will be 6. If you're playing a 4-player game, there'll be 2 dummy values added. And everybody sees what those values are. Works completely fine. So in a 3-player game, in the old edition, you were basically expected to play it like a 6-player game. So each player puts on each show twice. Works completely fine. And in some ways, if you don't mind the length of the game, 6-player is the way to go. Because there's no dummy values then. Just everybody shows... Every space on the board is going to be filled up with a player show. Everything's controlled by the players. So in that sense, it works great, but the 6-player game is the longest, and then the 3-player game is going to be as long as the 6-player game, right? In the newest edition, I forget about Atlantic Star, but I know in the newer edition of Show Manager, instead, they do dummy values just like the 4 and 5-player game. But there's 3 players, and there's 3 dummy values. Like, my family plays it that way, 3-player. I've offered to play it the other way, where each of us put on 2 shows, and they didn't seem that interested because they didn't want the game to take twice as long. If 2 players end up working on the same show, or even like all 3 players working on the same show, a city can fill up super, super fast, and then players don't have a chance to borrow money against it. Again, it's just something that I like to give people a heads up about, but the game still works completely fine, and that definitely adds a lot of tension too, right? I'm going to start this play. I really hope that by the time it comes around to me, that city, that musical is still in play so that I can borrow money from it. And then how much money, right? So it's even more tense in that way, and it does keep the game pretty short. I think my 3-player games have played in about 40-45 minutes, which would be much better than the 90 minutes of a 6-player game. But I do want to say that there aren't that many really good games for 6 players. At least it can be hard to find, right? In terms of finding a game that's really like a game, we're not talking about like a super heavy game necessarily, but still a game that gamers can enjoy, still has some thought to it, it still rewards good play and punishes bad play, and you want to play with 6 players, right? Alhambra, so Alhambra is the most famous game that Dirk Henn has designed, right? And I only play that with 6 players, not because it's best with 6 players. it's not best with 6 players. But when you have fewer, say 3 to 5 players, there's always other games to play. And then when there's 6, we're like, well, what do you want to play? You know, we don't necessarily want to play a light, easy game like Ave Caesar or Ave Kaiser. And you don't necessarily want to play a party game, but your options can be quite limited. So those games that can play up to 6, they're golden. Some people might not like a 90-ish minute game, which is, I suppose, certainly by today's standards, relatively light. But don't let lightness be a factor. The game is simple to learn, which is good. You can get into it easier. The game still punishes you if you play it badly. It's a game. It's a game. It's not a party game. It's not a crazy light game. It's a simple, refined game that doesn't have a lot of unnecessary extras and allows you to get right in and have fun. So Show Manager is probably one of my favorite games to play 6 players. Probably, I mean, Ave Caesar is my favorite game anyway, but that's not really what we're talking about here. That's a very light game. If I want to play like a 6-player game, and I want to play like a real game, you know, probably my first choice might be Medici. But this is one of my top choices as well. My family made the comparison to Dream Factory, which I've done a video on. And I can totally see why. It's the same kind of theme and setting, and you're hiring actors, and in the case of Dream Factory, other things, to put on shows, movies, or musicals, right? But thematically, it's kind of the same thing going on. Dream Factory, I think there's a lot more possibly for hobbyists to enjoy in Dream Factory, because at least a particular type of hobbyist, because it has an auction. And it's a really interesting closed economy auction, so that when somebody wins, they actually just give away their money to all the other players. Somebody could make the arguments like, well, maybe you don't need both. Maybe you don't need Dream Factory and Show Manager. And it's like, yeah, I could see somebody making that case. For what it's worth, I'm going to have both. My wife likes Show Manager more. I like Show Manager more, but just a little bit. And it feels also much breezier than Dream Factory, because in Dream Factory, in every turn there's an auction, right? And sometimes the auctions go really fast, but still it sometimes can create like a start-stop feeling, whereas this one just has this super smooth flow to it. And I asked my son, and my son said he likes them pretty much equally. So for what it's worth, in this household, Show Manager gets a very slight nod over Dream Factory. Maybe you don't need both in your collection, but there's a very strong case to be made for Show Manager. Dirk Henn's a great designer. This is one of his better designs. I like this game quite a bit, and this is a game that will be in my collection probably forever. Thanks for watching. Remember, older games like Show Manager and Atlantic Star don't stop being good just because newer games come out. Take care.